I'm Jennifer McFarquhar. I am the director, or I guess we are now co-directing the SHARPS program. I've actually been with the North Carolina Division of Public Health now for 7 years. And I've seen many of you all in different capacities. I've actually been in infection prevention for over 20 years. And so I'm excited to be with you today in this capacity. And as Dr. Lewis has stated, this meeting is unprecedented with a number of partners that have come together. So I'm really looking forward to working with you all in a collaborative way for performance improvement and infection prevention efforts. So I just want to take a minute briefly and introduce the rest of my team. You will actually hear Katie Steiter on the end and Heather Dubendris as well today. They'll be speaking with you at great length about some of the data here in North Carolina as well as nationally, and also the TAP assessments process. So you'll be hearing from them later. And Savannah Carrico is our other epidemiologist, and she's actually working with us strictly on data validation, but I wanted you to have kind of an eye on who our entire team is. So again, we are very excited to be with you today. So thank you.
Oh, and one more plug, we will be looking for a health educator, public health educator soon. So if anybody knows anybody that would be interested in that position, keep an eye on our website when that position gets posted.
I was actually just reminded, I think a few more housekeeping issues. You have a couple of dots in front of you. So if you would think about two of your top two challenges kind of in infection prevention and post a dot. There are posters on the side of the wall here to your right. And so there are 6 challenges, one for each. And so you have 2 dots. So pick 2 of those challenges that best represent what your challenges are in your facility. And we will address those, I think, in a panel presentation later today.
Use the yellow post-it notes if you want to expand on your challenges or if you have any questions that you want to ask the panel. And then the blue notes are for best practices. So if you have something that's working really well, we would love to hear that. And it can be anonymous, but if you have a best practice, we really would love for you to put some contact information down there as well. And we'll compile those.
And then for the people listening online, if you want to type in your challenges, your 2 biggest challenges, and then also if you have any you want to expand on that, then.
Or questions or best practices, definitely. We would love to hear about those, and we'll talk about, we hope to answer your questions here today as well, whether you're in person or online.
So I'm Claudia Perrin with the Patient Safety Organization, which is a component of the North Carolina Hospital Association. And this is just a quick overview of our agenda for today. We're going to have multiple speakers for you. Lunch will be around 11:30. If you guys are feeling antsy in your pants, if you feel like you need a break, just let us know. This is meant to be a casual environment. So if you need to get up and go get something to drink or take a phone call or use the restroom, please help yourself. We do want to, those are our welcome presenters for you with their titles. The slides will be available for you later. So you'll have all of this information. We want to start with a video for you. So it's about 11-minute video, so bear with us. It's just kind of, I know you are all clinicians in the room, so it's a little bit of basic, but I think it kind of sets the stage of taking a look at of infections kind of from the perspective of a layperson.
Saturday's Asiana air crash at SFO.
When a plane crashes, it's kind of a big deal.
Continuing coverage now on the Asiana plane crash investigation.
Investigators try to figure out what went so terribly wrong.
People freak out. There's usually a big investigation and a bunch of policy changes to make planes safer.
A plane crash investigation committee from several nations, including the United States, are meeting in Tripoli to try and figure out what happened.
There's pretty much a zero-tolerance policy for plane crashes in our society, and luckily planes are very safe because of it. But when a car crashes, it's not really a big deal. No one hears about car crashes on the news. We've decided as a society that car crashes are a cost of a really convenient thing. It's not worth a big investigation or a bunch of news coverage. This video isn't about cars and planes. It's about hospitals. Sometimes doctors and nurses, despite their best intentions, hurt patients. A tricky procedure goes wrong, and the patient suffers or dies. This happens all the time in hospitals. One estimate says that at least 210,000 people die every year due to preventable harm in hospitals. That's a huge number.
You know, I think we think of hospitals as this place where you go to get better, and that's just what happens. But there's a lot of risk in like going to a hospital. Like there's like a lot of things that go wrong, and they don't necessarily have to.
Some hospitals treat medical harm incidents like plane crashes, an unacceptable problem that needs investigation and policy change. Other hospitals treat them like car crashes, just a tragic loss of a risky business, but not ultimately preventable. The way hospitals react to harming their patients can have a huge impact on how often these errors occur. And that's what this video is about, how hospitals react when they harm their patients.
So I got interested in medical errors because it's this massive problem that we don't really talk about in healthcare.
Sarah and I headed to California to visit some people who would help us figure out how and why people are being harmed in hospitals, and whether or not it's preventable. I quickly realized that we were looking into something that was rarely talked about, but that had a huge effect on hospital patients around the country.
She loved dancing and running and jumping, and she never sat down. I mean, it's funny because we had these like family...
That's Claire. Her daughter Nora was born with an underdeveloped lung that required her to be in the hospital for quite a bit of time.
So we were using the beater, and I was like, oh yeah, there's a song called Beat It, so we put it on. And I mean, she used a beater as a microphone, and like I had a spoon, and we would just play it like as loud as possible, and she would just sing like, beat it.
During her treatment, Nora contracted something called a central line infection, which I'll explain in a minute.
The day before she got that first line infection, I had a friend over with her daughter, and like she was showing Nora how to do push-ups. I mean, it was just, you know, like totally fine. And then that was, I guess that, and then like 2 days later she got the infection. Our lives completely, and Nora's life, completely changed with that first line infection.
A central line is a tube that is placed in a vein that goes right to the heart. It's given to patients who need medicine that's too acidic to go through a normal IV, or to those who need to get their blood drawn often. The tube stays there. People walk around with this thing in, and it gives doctors and nurses really quick access to the bloodstream. It's a super useful invention. But we're talking about putting a tube through veins that go right to your heart. Just as it's good for getting medicine quickly into your bloodstream, it's also a foreign object in your most vital organ. So if any bacteria gets in there, it's very bad news. Nora had 4 of these central line infections over the course of her life. That's way above average. Claire thinks that the Stanford hospital where she was being treated could have prevented them. And that's the question we're trying to answer. Can these infections be prevented?
There has to be a better solution. Like this cannot be, because every line infection just took it out of her. Every line infection, you know, just took more out of her and more out of her.
She's saying hi, Nora? Yeah, because I turned it that, you know, I turned it so she could see herself. So
doctors and nurses have sanitation protocols when dealing with central lines, but even so, she contracted 3 more line infections while she was in the hospital. Her health was rapidly deteriorating as she approached her 4th birthday.
And she just like turned to me and was like, hold me. And so I picked her up, and she like put her arms and legs around me, and her head kind of went back, and she was sort of like gasping to breathe. And then she said, please help me feel better. And she just grabbed me around my neck, like so, I mean, I can still feel it, like so much strength, you know, like just squeezing me. And then she just basically lost consciousness and just kind of...
Nora died, her arms around her mother's neck, on November 22nd, 2013, just 3 weeks before her 4th birthday.
There were so many points along the way where like things could have gone differently, you know? And there were so many unnecessary mistakes that just led to that moment.
It's hard to know whether or not the line infections were the direct cause of her death. It's hard to disentangle everything that was going on with her to give a neat causal story of how she died. But what's sure is that these line infections caused her and her family immense suffering. Claire thinks that they should have never happened in the first place. She wrote a letter to the Stanford hospital where Nora died. She basically lined out the mistakes that she saw in the hospital and offered feedback on patient safety failures.
And there was no significant...
She got this letter in return.
Unfortunately, the placement of central lines is associated with a risk of infection. There is a risk of infection, even in the best of circumstances, which can never be entirely eliminated. Please be assured that multiple procedural protocols are in place to promote hand washing techniques and minimize the chance of infection. We understand and recognize your feeling regarding Nora's care, and we apologize that you were dissatisfied with your experience at LPCH. Yeah.
So were Nora's line infections just the result of a risky business? Or could they have been prevented? Stanford looked at central line infections with the car crash mentality, just an inevitable tragedy, instead of with a zero-tolerance plane crash mentality. But we headed north to a hospital outside of Sacramento that went 7 years in a row without a single central line infection. We wanted to figure out what they were doing to achieve this perfect record.
I was really interested in this concept of should there be any central line infections given what we know? Is zero possible? What does it take to get to zero? What are the obstacles there?
In 2005, this hospital had 11 central line infections. Research was just starting to come out on how to avoid these central line infections, and this Roseville hospital began to implement it. They had a few powerhouse nurses that were dedicated to making a difference, and they did.
We kind of thought you got infections.
Yeah.
It was no biggie. It was no big deal. It developed over time. We looked at people, we looked at equipment, we looked at skill set, and kind of all that came together to really develop the bundle that has been quite effective here.
You can't accept good enough. You have to go for eliminating those. If you've been at zero and you have an episode, you go in and you pick it apart and you do a root cause analysis and you say, what went wrong?
They treated line infections like plane crashes. A zero-tolerance policy was instituted, and they began to see results. We got to see these nurses in action as they inserted a central line. They suited us up in sterile dressing and began their work. The nurses were meticulous about the procedure. They had instituted standards of sterilization that assured minimum risk of infection.
Now what I'm going to do is, because my hand is not sterile, I touched the tourniquet. I'm going to take my first glove out. I'm going to throw away. Now I'm still sterile.
And these weren't just compassionate nurses who had an intrinsic motivation to do right. Instead, they were operating in a culture where they were expected to do it right. It was a team effort, where they had ownership and accountability, where the line infections were unacceptable.
When you have an outcome that isn't what you wanted, if you don't say, is there anything we could have done better? Is there any way we could have changed our interventions and resulted in a different outcome? People are going to get really, really sick, and they're going to die.
We left the hospital understanding how they had made it to zero central line infections.
Either way, you just see this very different approach from the two hospitals. One saying every error is a mistake, every error can be prevented in this particular type of error, and then one saying this is inevitable, this is the cost of doing business. And it's just really striking. Two hospitals 3 hours away from each other, these very different attitudes.
As I headed back to DC, I kept thinking of Nora. If Stanford had an attitude a little bit more like Roseville, maybe she would still be alive today, just another 5-year-old little girl. Surely she and her family wouldn't have suffered as much. To get the final word on this subject, we went to Baltimore to talk to Peter Pronovost at Johns Hopkins Medical Center. He's basically the godfather of all of the research behind preventing central line infections.
We started investigating every infection as a defect. Again, a very important culture change where in the past we just accepted them and we said, no. If we really view these as defects, everyone needs to be investigated and reported on and find out why they would happen. We routinely invite patients back to inform us, to learn with us, to share with us. It is both healing for them and our clinicians, but importantly, it also is wise and fruitful for us to learn and improve mistakes.
As we finished up reporting, Sarah and I realized that Nora's death actually represents two tragedies. The first was, of course, the fact that a little girl suffered and died. But the second and perhaps more harmful tragedy is that the hospital where it happened didn't take the opportunity to learn from it.
I think that's worse for patients who are going to be treated there in the future. It really makes a world of difference in healthcare, whether you see patient harm as something that's preventable or inevitable, and getting people to the preventable mindset from the inevitable one. It has the potential to alleviate a lot of suffering, to prevent a lot of deaths. I became convinced attitude towards harm makes all the difference, and that there's space for our healthcare system to improve to taking a more preventable attitude towards patient harm.
what I particularly liked about it was that they picked two hospitals that weren't far from each other, which kind of resonates with today, right? So we're all from North Carolina, and the topic of clotting clopsy is not, this is not new stuff that we're going to be talking about. So I'm really excited for Heather to go over some of the data. Real quick, I just want to show you for the activity that was mentioned in the opening. So the themes are posted over there. They're also listed here. So it's the insertion practices, maintenance practices, documentation practices, training and competency, engagement and leadership and culture. So we were asking you to use your dots and to kind of vote with your dots on where are your biggest barriers, your challenges, and you know, if it's not one of the ones that we have listed, let us know and we'll make a new one, okay? And then use your yellow stickies to elaborate or write any questions or concerns that you have related to those main topics. And then if you have a best practice, please use your blue or blue-green ones and share what that best practice is. And if you're willing, write your name, your organization, and email address. You don't have to put exactly what your best practice is, but after today, we'll collaborate those into a single document and share that with the group to say, related to this theme, this organization, and this contact person has a best practice and that person's willing to be contacted to share some more information about it. Does that sound okay? All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
Thank you. So I'm really glad that we decided to start this morning with a personal patient story, because I think, especially as I go through these slides and we start thinking in these numbers that are quite large, it's really important for us to keep in mind that these each number that I talk about here represents a person and how their life was affected. And, you know, I already know just from the fact that you guys have shown up here today that you guys are part of facilities that are viewing these infections as plane crashes and wanting to do more. So thank you for that. So to start today, I'm just going to provide a high-level overview of what I'm talking about when we talk about device-associated infection surveillance. I think this will be familiar to many of you, but I always just like to make sure that we're all starting from an even playing field. And then I'll go into some of the national and state-specific device-associated infections data, including trends over time, by location, and other key utilization facts. So to start at a very high level, the definition of what a healthcare-associated infection is. So on a high level, what we're considering is any infection that's acquired as a consequence of healthcare or acquired by a healthcare worker as part of their duty. And, you know, I think when HAIs first started coming into the public health sphere, we really felt that this was centered around hospitals, but this has since expanded. So this is in any healthcare setting, outpatient clinics, long-term care, any setting where a patient is receiving care. So why do we conduct surveillance? This number right here is one of the reasons. Does anybody have a guess as to what this number represents? Yes, absolutely. So this is the number of healthcare-associated infections reported by acute care hospitals in North Carolina in 2017. So this includes the 5 reportable HAIs that CMS requires reporting into NHSN. This doesn't include all healthcare-associated infections, but these are the data that we have. So over 4,000 infections in our state last year. And we estimate that it costs almost $20 million, at least, in excess costs. This estimate comes from the APIC cost calculator. Are you guys familiar with that? So one huge caveat here is that cost calculator looks at central line related bloodstream infections, which is different than central line associated bloodstream infections. So this cost estimate here is not taking into account our CLOPSY data, since we couldn't measure that. So we know that it's well over this estimate here, but almost 20 million at least in excess costs in our state. Another reason we conduct surveillance is because we know that nationally, 1 in 25 hospitalized patients will have a healthcare-associated infection. And that translates to approximately 75,000 deaths each year in the United States as a result of healthcare-associated infections. Now, obviously, that means that there's work to be done, and that's a staggering number. But the good news is that we've seen over time that this number can be impacted when we work together in partnership. So in 2002, the estimate for the number of deaths due to HAIs was 99,000, and so that number has dropped to 75,000 by 2014. So that was around the time that HAI programs were starting to pop up in health departments throughout the country. That was around the time that surveillance started to become more routine, and we really started to work together in a collaborative approach. So we have seen progress. So while this number is, I think we can all agree, unacceptable and something we want to move the needle on, I think it's encouraging to show that this really is a story of progress. NHSN, as I'm sure you are all well aware, is the system that we use, the National Healthcare Safety Network, to track many of these HAIs. It's a free web-based software. And this number right here, I think, is really meaningful that currently there are over 17,000 facilities putting data into NHSN. So when we're talking about comparisons to a standard population, we're really talking about a lot of data that has been entered by many different facilities. And so those estimates are robust. Here in North Carolina, what we require our healthcare facilities to report is the same as what CMS requires. So for acute care hospitals, we're looking at central line associated bloodstream infections or CLABSIs, catheter associated urinary tract infection or CAUTI, surgical site infections following colon or hysterectomy procedures. And then we also have our 2 lab ID proxy measures for C. difficile and for MRSA in the bloodstream. The main measure we use when we talk about this is the standardized infection ratio. So this is the measure that compares the number of infections that your facility reported to what would be predicted based on that national baseline data. And so that predicted number is based on all of the data that has been entered by all of the facilities like you that report. So when we look at what an SIR means, if you have an SIR of 1, that means you have about the same number of infections reported as predicted based on the US baseline. Greater than 1 is more infections, and less than 1 is fewer infections than predicted based on that baseline data. Another measure that I'll spend some time talking about today that is new with the new 2015 baseline is the standardized utilization ratio. Just a show of hands before I go into this, how many of you have seen or used the SUR? Okay, so a few of you, but it is a newer measure. So the SUR, what we're looking at is we're looking at device utilization compared to the national experience. And this is important because when we talk about utilization, we're really talking about your exposure. So how long are patients having central lines? Because if you don't have a central line, you can't get a CLABSI, right? So one of the utility of this measure is that we're looking at carefully determining the necessity of those lines, central lines and catheter lines, and removing them as soon as they're no longer needed to really reduce that exposure for device-associated infections. And because this is a utilization ratio, we're comparing you to the baseline population. So rather than just looking at your own utilization rate over time, this is a comparison that is risk-adjusted based on many factors that your facility-specific demographics. And so the number of predicted device stays takes into account many different variables, and this varies some based on which infection we're looking at, but generally it's considering your location type, your facility bed size, are you affiliated with a medical school, what kind of facility are you? Are you a acute care hospital or a short-term acute care hospital? And the risk factors that it takes into account are really what would put you at greater risk for needing longer utilization time. And then just like the SIR, the SUR has a pretty simple interpretation. So an SUR of 1 means that the same number of device days is reported in your facility as predicted based on the national baseline data. So any other hospital that has a similar makeup as yours, we would expect you to have about the same. Greater than 1 means more device days than predicted, and less than 1 means fewer. Now, unlike the SIR, where we can say this is necessarily better or worse, an SUR of greater than 1 doesn't necessarily mean worse. It just means it's something to look at because your exposure period is longer. So if you can reduce that exposure period, then likely that would impact your overall number of infections. Does anybody have any questions about that? Does that make sense? And when I give you the examples, we can talk about it more.
And since I'm trending data over time today, I also wanted to set the framework of the two baselines that we use when we talk about data. So originally, when the National Healthcare Safety Network started showing SIR data, they used an original baseline, and so each HAI had a different year that was that baseline time period. So for CLABSI, that was 2006 to 2008, so they took all of the data that had been entered in that 2-year time period and used those that standard population when comparing your observed to calculate your predicted. In 2015, you probably saw there was a lot of communication about the new baseline or the re-baseline. And so we needed a more up-to-date standard population to be comparing to because so much progress had been made. So this new baseline allowed us to look at whether or not we needed to change the risk factors for what we're adjusting for, and also just make sure we were giving you a more fair comparison. So whenever you look at a graph, and I'll make sure to state it when I'm showing you these here, it's important to look at which baseline you're looking at so you know what the comparison population is. So that very high-level overview, I'll go into some of our trend data. And I think one of the things that I really want you to take away from this is we're not collecting your data just so we can like stick it in a box and never look at it again. These data that I'm talking about here today are one of the major drivers as to why we decided to focus on CLABSI and CAUTI for this day today. So we really want these data to drive action. On the state level, we're using it to inform our prevention efforts and our priorities. And hopefully some of these data you can take back to your facility to drive action as well. So first I'll look at the CLABSI data. Some of you may have seen this in a report that CDC produced earlier this year, but they looked at their data from 2006 into 2016 to see what kind of progress had been made. And we can see that CLABSI, this is their SIR, and it's under the original baseline, had a steady decrease over time. So they actually dropped almost 50% between 2010 and 2014. But one of the things that I want to, between 2010 and 2016. But one of the things that I want to point out is this 2014 period, we see an uptick between 2014 and 2015, and then it kind of goes down again into 2016. So I'm going to pull this data out to look a little closer to see what might have been going on. So the SIR nationally in 2014 was 0.49, so that's less than 1, so we know that's better than predicted by the standard baseline. But we also know that being better isn't enough, we want to keep working towards 0. And then when we look at 2015, that jumps back up to 0.6, which is an 11% increase from the previous year. And then it goes back down again in 2016. So one of the explanations is that there were some surveillance definition changes in 2015. So the repeat infection timeframe came into play, and there were also changes to the CAUTI definition, which excluded yeast, and also some changes to what could be considered a secondary infection for a BSI, which created this artificial increase. So when the definition changed, more things counted as primary BSIs than they did in the previous year. So we see this uptick. And one of the ways we can say with certainty that most of this increase nationally was because of these definition changes is because we then see that decrease in the previous year. So if this was really an increasing trend, we would expect that to continue to go. But what we see is the definition changes and then we kind of level off again. Does that make sense? Okay. And then this is our North Carolina data. So before we were seeing that nice downward slope nationally over time. North Carolina didn't begin reporting until 2012, so we can't look at data prior to then, but what we can see is we did see some early decreases, particularly 2014, we saw a pretty big decrease. And when we looked at what happened in 2014 in North Carolina, well, one of the things that happened was everybody came together. So there was some collaborative work surrounding CLABSI and some specific attention being placed on CLABSI prevention efforts. And then we see that increase in 2015, which at first glance, we might think, well, nationally there was an increase too, and so maybe that's okay. But we continue that trend in 2016. And actually, when you look at the data side by side, our increase in 2015 and 2016 is more than what we were seeing nationally. So what's happening in North Carolina is not trending with the national experience. To look at this another way, we'll pull up that same table that I had before for the US SIR, where we had the 11% increase followed by the 4% decrease. And if we look at North Carolina's SIR,
we actually saw an 18% increase between 2014 and 2015. So that's greater than what was explained nationally by the definition changes alone. And then we continued to see a slow increase in 2016 as well. And so when we started looking at these data was when we started to reach out to NCHA to say, you know, what work is being done? What are you hearing from hospitals? What's going on? We really wanted to do a deeper dive to figure out where we could focus prevention efforts to see some of the same decreasing trends that we were seeing nationally. So all of this data I presented up until this point is under the 2006 to 2008 baseline. But what about under that new baseline? Because we were all told that the new baseline was a more accurate risk adjustment for these more recent years. So nationally, they still continue to see a decrease between 2015 and 2016 when looking at that new baseline. For those of you that aren't in the data every day, we're not able to go back before 2015 using this new baseline because 2015 was the year we used to create that standard population. So we can't talk about the trends prior to 2015 when looking at this new risk-adjusted baseline. So overall, there was, when we look at the new baseline between 2015 and 2016, there was a 10% decrease nationally in the number of CLABSIs compared to what was expected. And this is North Carolina under the new baseline. And I also included 2017 data there because we had it. We don't have those numbers from the national perspective yet, but you can see we're not really changing. So they saw a 10% decrease between 2015 and 2016. Our 2015 SIR was 1.06 and our 2016 SIR was 1.05. So we're really not changing. So this picture maybe looks a little more encouraging than under the old baseline. We're not increasing, but we're also not making those improvements that we're seeing nationwide. And so from a patient safety perspective, there is still a lot of work to be done with CLABSIs. So after we established that there was a problem by looking at this data and having conversations with our state stakeholders and partners and some of our hospitals as we went out on data validation visits, another question that I had was where CLABSIs was commonly reported. Can we drill down to figure out where there might be a problem in North Carolina to focus? And so nationally, we see that the majority of CLABSIs occur in med-surg wards. So 55% of CLABSIs nationally are happening in wards. But when we look at North Carolina, over half of our CLABSIs are happening in ICUs. So that's maybe an area for us to focus further. Does anybody have any questions at that point? I'm going to do a deeper dive into our single year of HAI data to show kind of what we're looking at, what we're trying to prioritize. But I'd just like to stop for a second because I know that's a lot of information that I've thrown at you. Yeah. Anything anybody on my team wants to highlight? Do you have anything else you'd say, Katie? Okay. And I'm happy to talk afterwards if there's more questions. So the data I'm going to present next come from our annual report, which is not yet available online, but will be shortly. So you guys get a little bit of a sneak peek today. So all of these data will focus on 2017 data as a single snapshot in time, and we'll look at the 2015 baseline, so that newer risk adjustment. So when we look at CLABSIs in adult and pediatric locations in 2017, we were about the same as the national experience. So overall, acute care hospitals reported 533 CLABSIs compared to the 521 that were predicted. So we're experiencing CLABSIs at about the same as other hospitals with similar makeup throughout the country. And if we break that down a little further, so this might be kind of hard to see for those of you in the back, but what this is the SIR for CLABSIs by location type. So what we can see is it's important to remember that these SIRs are risk adjusted. So this is already taken into account if you're at an increased risk for having a CLABSI in a burn ICU versus a surgical ward, that should be taken care of in that risk adjustment process. So what we're seeing here is even after risk adjustment, there's still a lot of variability by location type in our CLABSIs. So we can see that some of our locations, like our burn ICUs, our pediatric medical surgical wards, are still experiencing more infections than would be predicted based on the national baseline experience after risk adjustment. While other locations, like pediatric cardiothoracic ICUs, are experiencing fewer infections than predicted based on the national baseline experience.
So this will be in our report, and one of the things that I would encourage you to do is to look at your information by location type as well. And if something is happening that's different from the national experience, that might be a place for you to do some more drill down to figure out what's working, what's happening in your facility. The other way we slice this data is to look at CLABSIs and pediatric ICUs and wards by hospital-sized group. So again, hospital size is a risk adjustment variable in NHSN, so we would expect that these would be about the same. But what we see is that our larger hospitals and our hospitals with primary medical size affiliation still have SIRs that are different than our smaller hospital size groups. The other question that I asked, yes, sorry, go ahead.
Is that by licensed beds or staff beds?
So this is by the number of beds that you report in your annual hospital survey. So it's whatever you're putting in your NHSN survey for your hospital bed size. That's one of the reasons that it's so important to review those hospital surveys and check for errors. We try to do that for you when we're doing this annual report. So some of you may have received emails from me. If I noticed last year you said you were a 400 bed size facility and this year you're saying that you have 4, that's a really easy keystroke error for me to pick up on and comment on. But we have over 113 acute care hospitals that we're doing this report for, so we definitely don't catch them all. So that would be one take-home message that I would have for you guys today, is to go back and check that annual survey, because that's where all of these risk adjustments come from. So if those data aren't correct, then you may be improperly being risk adjusted for the number of a specific infection we would predict. The other thing that we want to look at is the organism breakdown. So maybe we're seeing a change in the type of organisms that are causing CLABSIs, and based on the pathogen, maybe we can start to determine where the error is happening that's causing these CLABSIs to increase. And so in 2017, for adult and pediatric CLABSIs, Candida was the #1 pathogen, followed by Enterococcus and Staph aureus. We also look at this pathogen data in terms of resistance. So this figure here is showing, out of all, the green shows that out of all of the Staph aureus that was associated with a CLABSI in an adult or pediatric location, what percentage of those were MRSA? And so we saw 46% of isolates that were associated with a CLABSI infection and were Staph aureus were MRSA. The orange is looking at Enterococcus, and so when we're considering resistance in Enterococcus, we're looking at VRE, or vancomycin resistant, and about 25% of those isolates were vancomycin resistant. And then that pink, we're looking at Enterobacteriaceae, and so those are those gut bacteria that can be resistant to carbapenems. And you can see that only 3% of the Enterobacteriaceae that were pathogens associated with bloodstream infections were carbapenem resistant. Now, all of the data we've looked at to this point is looking at adult and pediatric locations. We also do surveillance of CLABSIs in NICUs, but because the risk factors for NICUs are different, I actually pulled that data out separately. So we'll look at that now. So in NICUs in North Carolina, we observed 57 CLABSIs in 2017 compared to the 66 that were predicted. And after risk adjustment, and when we look at that confidence interval, that's about the same as what we would predict. This first figure is showing by NICU level, so a level 3 compared to a level 2, and we can see there's some variability there. And again, we look at it by hospital size group, and so the 2 columns that are blank are because we didn't have any hospitals in that size group that reported having NICU locations. So we're just looking at those with 100 to 200 beds, greater than 400 beds, or those with a primary medical school affiliation. And there's not as much variability within the NICU CLABSIs as we saw on the earlier slides for adult and pediatric. This slide here I always think is really interesting to show with the NICU compared to the adult and pediatric, because if you remember, I said Candida was the #1 pathogen for adult and pediatric CLABSIs in North Carolina, and here it's down on number 3. So the #1 pathogen that we see in CLABSIs in NICUs is Staph aureus. And to me, this just reinforces that the risk factors in a NICU setting are a little bit different than in the adult and pediatric population. And then here's that same resistance graph again, although we only have the orange bar, and that's because we didn't have any resistance identified among Enterobacteriaceae or Enterococcus in 2017 in neonatal CLABSIs.
And so we see about 29% of our Staph aureus causing CLABSIs in NICUs in 2017 that were MRSA or methicillin resistant. So this data that I'm presenting next focuses on the SUR instead of the SIR. So that was that metric that we went over earlier that looks at device utilization. And again, this can show the length of exposure for device-associated infection. And so this chart here, what it's showing you is the distribution of the SUR across reporting facilities. So that median SUR was 0.89. But the range for hospitals was between 0.24 and 2.21 SUR. So if you go back and look at your facility's SUR for adult and pediatric CLABSIs, you can kind of see where you fall in that distribution of North Carolina facilities and start to think about what that exposure means. As overall, we reported fewer central experience. So that's the good news. Unit type, and surgical medical ward abilities type has fewer as a national experience, or 5, most pediatric medical wards in the pediatric. So in those, utilization is more adjustment. So ways you can look at these two measures together. Types that have a really high SIR, in North Carolina, for instance. Oh, then to me, what that says is duration, but that there's something happening. Look at central line maintenance versus the pediatric SIR was low, but we still high. And so getting that exposure are even more. And so these are just to sort of inform prevention. And is that data I presented? Move on to CAUTI if not, and I'm happy. National picture for CAUTI. See that this is much more stagnant. There was a lack of early progress. Jumps out to me, even if you're not somebody that, what the heck? Because all of a sudden we see what happened in 2016. Yeah, the definition changed. Pathogen. So that explains. And the good news as well. So trend 2012 to 2014 baseline in 2015 and 2016. Now, since this is that drop, how much can we are doing every day in the prevention efforts that are nationally? They tried to answer that question, and so this graph is, but they went back and retroactively applied that case 9, I think, included anything that pathogen, and they do still trend. And so over time, even if this was data, so that's something I hope to look at later. But what we extrapolate based on this map, go back to our state figure, is that most of our decline was seen because that 2015 and 2016 bar are almost identical. So again, when we're resources, limited time, limited the CAUTI most commonly reported. It was nationally, it's about a 50-50 split between ICUs and wards. Carolina, overwhelmingly, our infections are being seen in our ICU. Just like I did with SOTC, I'm going to take a deeper, be a snapshot of 2017, and these will all be presented under the most recent 2015 baseline. So in 2017, 637 infections compared to the 717 that were predicted by the national experience. Seeing progress, even excluding the yeast packet, even compared to that more, we are experiencing fewer CODIs. By location type, and you can even after risk adjustment. So medical cardiac locations performed worse with more infections than predicted. Medical surgical ICUs and neurologic ICUs reported fewer infections than predicted. And most of the other locations reported about the same number of infections as predicted. And I apologize, I should have oriented you to this in the beginning, but those gray bars that you're seeing are the 95% confidence intervals. So the blue bar interval is telling us how sure are we that that's the actual estimate. So if the gray bar is one, then that means the gray bars are both ends are. So I apologize, I should have said. If we look at it by location type, we see that for the most part, by size, hospital size, for the most part, that's pretty similar. But we do see that our hospitals with less than 100 beds and our primary medical school affiliated hospitals experience with fewer. The other three, because those bars are number of CODIs as predicted. And E. coli is by far associated with CODI and reporting location can including those of yeast. If we look at we see, so there were 14 CODIs attributed to Staphylococcus aureus in 2017, and 8, or about 57% of those, were resistant to methicillin. We have 13% of the Enterococcus isolates that were resistant to vancomycin or were considered BRE. And then again, a small percentage of our Enterobacteriaceae, just 3%, among Enterobacteriaceae identified from reported CODIs that were resistant to carbapenem. If we look at the utilization data for catheters this time, in adult and pediatric wards, as well as FUR 0.9, I should say catheter by the national experience. Broad, so the minimum FUR we saw in reporting hospitals in North Carolina was 0.13, so that's a pretty low utilization rate shakeup. And then the maximum was 2.14, which is more than we would expect compared to the national experience. So again, those numbers you can look at and then kind of see where your facility falls with catheter line usage compared to the state picture. That was a whirlwind drive-through of what our data looks like in North Carolina. I don't expect you to remember it all, but really what I wanted to drive home today is that we're using these data to drive our decisions, to figure out where we're going to, and really using this data to tell a story. So the story you heard at the beginning was a story of an N of 1, and that is very powerful, and I don't want you to forget it. I know that all of you are working on the front lines, and I'm sure you have those same stories yourself. But the bigger picture, the data also tells a story and serves as a call to action. So we can use these data to track, prevent, and eliminate healthcare-associated infections. And as we'll see with Katie's talk later today, these data can also help pinpoint areas for further improvement for continued process. And again, the point of today is to show that we can come together and collectively really drive these numbers down. And so
thank you all for your work that you're doing to collaboratively reduce healthcare-associated infections and improve patient. Here is my contact information, and I'd be happy to discuss any of these questions, or if you have questions about your own data, either now or at the break. And I'm not sure if there's any questions on the online portal. Okay.
On the low SURs, did we find out who has those low SURs so we'll know what they're doing?
Yeah, so that's not a name that I can release publicly, but I can say that that's part of the beauty of having a state health department that has your data, is that when we see those, we can reach out to them and solicit success stories. That's something that we're in the process of doing as we look at these data. And our hope is that when we reach out and talk with these facilities, if there are information with the rest of our facilities. So we're working on that, yeah. Thank you.
When the information is published online, will it show the N of the number of units that are included in that data set? Because I've covered the burn unit at my hospital, and I feel like that's a pretty small N.
It is, and that's why that confidence interval is so
yes, and I'm really curious as to what the N is, and so are the burn surgeons and leadership about who they're being compared to. They're always curious about that, and I don't know what the N is in North Carolina.
Yeah, so we don't typically publish that in our consumer report, but that's certainly something we could talk about.
Perfect.
I can tell you we do not have very many burn ICUs in North Carolina. It's a very low end, and that's part of the reason that confidence interval stays so wide.
Okay.
And to use is that under are risk adjusted separately than the other locations, and that's because we expect that's a really high acuity patient population. So the number of predicted in a burn ICU is higher than it is in other locations. But you're absolutely right, that is a small N.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Other questions? All right, well, this is, we'll be talking about data all day long, but I think this is the most data heavy that you'll see. I think the rest of today, we're really focusing on what you can do with these data. And so I hope you feel empowered to go back and take a look at your data and to really use your data for action as you move throughout the day. So I will be here all day, as will the rest